Thank you to Rosemary and the Athens Centre for inviting me to speak tonight and for letting me spend so much time here over the last few years. I really appreciate it. Is the sound okay like that? Okay. Okay. Good. So, I'm William Davis. I work in comparative literature. And tonight I want to talk just a little bit about a couple of romantic texts that have to do with Greece, specifically set in Acrocorinth. One is Hölderlin's only novel, the German romantic who lived from 1770 to 1843, Hyperion. This is a translation I'll be quoting from, referring to tonight. A fairly recent translation by Ross Benjamin that is quite good and I've used with students several times. It opens at the top of Acrocorinth in the spring of 1771, just after the failed Orlov revolt, or the Orlovika. Byron's tragic narrative poem, The Siege of Corinth, from 1816, is set in the midst of another conflict, the Ottoman-Venetian conflict of 1715. There were many of them. This is the one from 1715. And it finds its explosive conclusion also above the ancient city of Corinth. Well, we have a few images I will show and refer to a couple of things as we go along. I won't be talking about them. They're more just for sake of interest. And a few passages that I will be referring to, I'll put up so you can look at them better and follow along better. So today I'd like to just attempt a brief reading of portions of these Romantic era texts, focusing specifically on some connections and intertwining between literature, philosophy, and the Hellenism, Philhellenism, to which John just referred. This love of Greece that was so prominent in the era among Western Europeans, and that particularly formed an important part of the poetic and personal identities of these two poets specifically. But more focused, I would like to talk about the romantic trope, image, idea, and its attendant metaphors of oneness. The idea of being one with everything, being connected to the universe around us. And I'm going to suggest that this dream, vision, idea, ideal, imaginary concept of oneness is inextricably intertwined, connected, woven into a philosophical movement of the time that's generally called transcendental idealism. We'll get to that in a moment. So, first of all, Hyperion, as I mentioned, Hölderlin's novel, published in its final form in 1799, set a few decades earlier, opens in 1771 on the, quote, heights of the Corinthian Isthmus. I'll try to remember to look at a few of our images here. From a spot, as we know, with views of ancient Corinth as well as both the Aegean and Ionian sides of the Mediterranean. So we're once at an entirely real location, I'm sure many of us in this room have been to a number of times, but at the same time, as John mentioned earlier, it's an imaginary location for Hölderlin, who had never been to Greece himself. Most of the descriptions that Hölderlin used of the Greek landscape he derived from a book by a man named Richard Chandler, who lived from 1738 to 1810, and who was sent to Greece in the 1760s. So he was in Greece and Turkey from 1764 to 66. He'd been sent by an English Society of Dilettanti, it's called. There's Hölderlin. You know, it was sort of a fellowship in the day. I mean, one of the reasons that people like Hölderlin, who had little means, he wasn't even able to come to Italy. Many northern romantics at least made it to Italy. But travel was so expensive and difficult, and of course, when Greece at that time was a part of the Ottoman Empire, made things even more complicated and difficult to travel. So very few romantics who wrote about Greece or were in love with Greece actually came to Greece, as John pointed out. Well, this is the title page of the German translation of Chandler's work that was very influential, actually. The novel itself, Hölderlin's novel then, is an epistolary novel. It exists as a series of letters. It begins in medias res, as Hyperion reflects on his life, sends his memories as a series of letters back to his friend Bellarmine, living in Germany. We don't know anything more about Bellarmine. As the novel opens, gazing down from the heights of Acrocorinth onto the landscape of the isthmus, Hyperion is thus also gazing back on his own life, which he views as a series of catastrophes. All of his friends are either dead or vanished, including the love of his life, Diotima. His dreams of restoring Greece to its former glory have fallen in the bloody massacres of the failed revolt. He has himself been severely wounded in the famous Battle of Chesme, which took place in July of 1770, an explosion and everything. I have nothing that I may call my own, complains Hyperion as the novel opens. Distant and dead are my loved ones. I hear nothing more of them from any voice. Well, today we might call his condition something like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. He is, after all, a veteran of a very nasty military conflict. And not only that, most of his other friends and lovers are gone or dead. But I would like to point out that Hölderlin here carefully represents Hyperion's suffering not simply as sorrow in the face of loss and recent tragic events, but more specifically as a division from unity, cutting off, dividing. The landscape on which he gazes reflects his psychic state, I would like to suggest. On the one hand, there's a certain therapeutic effect to his wanderings in Acrocorinth. Let me just, here we have just some passages from the novel I'm referring to here. So there's this therapeutic effect for him up there on the heights of the isthmus looking down. As he says, quote, "Every morning I'm on the heights of the Corinthian isthmus and, like a bee among flowers, my soul often flies back and forth between the seas, that to the right and left cool the feet of my glowing mountains," end quote. But this palliative healing effect is a short duration, quickly dispelled by the recurring after effects of trauma, symbolized by the cries of jackals that haunt the crag in which he stands. Quote, "The cry of the jackal that sings its wild dirge among the stone heaps of antiquity startles me out of my dreams." Well, I think and would like to suggest that we can read the landscape of an isthmus in a number of different ways, perhaps. So on the one hand, an isthmus is a place where the landscape brings things together, you might say. Not unlike the Michelangelo's hand of God reaching down to touch Adam, or finger of God, is collecting the land and the sea together in one point. On the other hand, we might see an isthmus like a knife edge cutting through the sea, dividing, in this case, the Aegean from the Ionian, dividing the Peloponnesus from the mainland of Greece, with this narrow strip of land, only roughly 6 kilometers across, that, forever keeps these things, sea and land, from coming fully together. So if you're going to start to read this landscape metaphorically, I think it works both ways, as a bringing together and a separating. And this is reflected then, as I suggest, in Hyperion's psychic state himself. I mean, from a psychological, psychoanalytic perspective, it's hard not to see Hyperion's state also as a sort of symbolic castration, as it were, which the cutting maybe seems to reflect. Now, of course, I'm leaving out the canal out of the equation. It wasn't there at the time that Hölderlin wrote this, 1893. I don't know what we would say about that. Maybe that would be a symbolic circumcision or something. Anyway, in line with this pessimistic reading of the landscape, Hyperion's letter alludes to a number of divisions or oppositions: high, low, joy, sorrow, thought, action, child, adult. Most significantly, those splittings, cuttings, oppositions between Greece as it was, or Greece as it should be, this ideal imaginary Greece, and Greece as it is somehow. Quoting Hyperion again, "I often stand at this height, Bellarmine, but a moment of reflection hurls me down. I reflect and find myself as I was before, alone with all the pains of mortality. And the asylum of my heart, the world's eternal unity, is gone. Nature closes her arms, and I stand like a stranger before her and do not comprehend her. In other words, I'm alone here, cut off from everything out there that I want to be a part of, or that I wish to be a part of, cut off from this eternal unity of the world. And I want us to keep that term in mind, the world's eternal unity. So much of this crisis, this character faces here, is a crisis around this problem of connection and alienation, unified and divided. So, in the same opening passage, we find these traumatic divisions healed, mollified by a compensatory fantasy of oneness with the universe that I want to get to. So, quoting again, to be one with all that lives, to return and bless its self-oblivion and to be all of nature. That is the summit of thought and joys. That is the holy mountain height, the place of eternal repose, where the midday loses its welter, and the thunder its voice, and the boiling sea resembles the billowing field of grain. Now, this just so you can continue the passage there. So this idea of an individual connecting with a nature beyond, outside, is not certainly unknown in Romanticism otherwise. I mean, it comes up in poems by Goethe, Novalis, Chateaubriand, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, to name a few people. The idea of this metaphor of oneness with nature that has sort of pantheistically replaced traditional Christian God is rife in this time. But what I would like to suggest is that its familiarity should not cause us to neglect some of its really interesting aspects. And what I'm arguing is that this language, these metaphors that Hölderlin is using here, are caught up with, implicated in, some philosophical ideas of the time that involve subjectivity, nature, the connections between humans and the world that arises in the late 18th century. So, I'm going to have to get philosophical just for a moment here. Let's try to explain a little bit about this philosophy. But don't worry, it'll all be over soon. And I'll try to keep it as painless as possible. Start with Immanuel Kant, and just very briefly stated, the issue here is a philosophical problem, a conundrum, a question that plagued people, that people lost sleep over in the late 18th century, poets and thinkers, people like Hölderlin and Shelley and Goethe and so on. And the problem, briefly expressed, would be something like, how can I know, standing here, that I have a meaningful connection to something outside of me over there? How can I know that my representations or experience of the world is in that sense valid, or experience connection with other people? How can I know that I'm not just imposing myself onto the world, as it were? And in part, Kant had suggested, that human perception, it makes more sense to think about the way we encounter the world if we consider that, well, we don't just experience the world as it is as human beings, argued Kant. We perceive the world only through the categories of our own perception that are available to us. We're caught in time and space, for example. We see things in temporal sequences, not because they are that way, but because that's how we are capable of seeing them, because that's the kind of creatures we are. Now, that was sort of Kant's, one of his main ideas that caused a lot of controversy, but it leads to this problem of a split between a subject and the object. Subject, again, here, me standing here, cut off from objects around me. What connection do I have to them? So, in the late 18th century, some of these philosophers I'm talking about here tried to come to terms with this problem. Tried to think about how can we get the subject and object back together again, for example. So what that brings us to this guy, Fichte, for a second, and just for a brief moment. Fichte's solution, again, really briefly stated, is to focus all his attention on the subject part of that equation. So forget about the object. Really the way the human mind works is we, through self-reflection, becoming aware of ourselves, become an object to ourselves, we create a world around us. It's all enclosed in the subject. Now, it's much more complicated than that, but just to keep that idea in mind for a moment briefly, as Fichte puts it, there's a little quotation from Fichte. This passage from the external to the internal, or vice versa, is precisely what is in question. It is precisely the task of the critical philosophy to show that no such passage is required, that everything which occurs in our mind can be completely explained and comprehended on the basis of the mind itself. Well, that's, in a nutshell, his view, that everything is in the mind, therefore don't worry about what's outside of you. There's nothing outside of you. Now, for various reasons, a lot of people objected to this general view. Among those people were poets and artists of the time. Famously, Samuel Taylor Coleridge in England, who was one of the people who brought this German philosophy to England, who saw this as what he called egoism. Goethe in Germany, who thought that it cut, nature out of the equation, and art and beauty. So then we have coming onto the scene these three amigos, these three guys here, in their youth, Hölderlin, the philosopher Friedrich Schelling, and the philosopher Hegel, all by coincidence, were roommates at the University of Tübingen. And in their 20s, they started to try to come to terms with these very philosophical problems, following Fichte and eventually rebelling against him. So at this period of time we're talking about now, about 1774-75, mainly Hölderlin and Friedrich Schelling were collaborating, working together. Hegel later became more famous and eclipsed Schelling in importance as a philosopher, but at this time we're really talking about Hölderlin and Schelling. And here's what they do in a nutshell. Here's what they come up with, briefly put. They take this concept that had been around for a while, that's called generally intellectual intuition, and try to give it a new vitality, new life. So it's a philosophical term that had been around for a while. Intellektuelle Anschauung in German, intellectual intuition. And intellectual here just means non-material, non-physical. Like a sixth sense, if you will. They argue that, okay, so Kant says we have these categories of perception, but there's another form of perception, an intellectual, again, non-physical, non-sensory, non-sensual form of perception that allows us to connect to the world. And, well, I'll just put this up here for a moment. They had these three roommates and friends and collaborators actually had a motto in Greek, which we can see over here, en kai pan, or hen kai pan. There was a Neoplatonic motto that they had adopted. And what we have in front of us here, this image, is actually Hegel's guest book or album that he had, that when friends would come visit him, they would write something in. And Hölderlin has written a quotation from Goethe up there that says basically, well, it's a quotation from Goethe's play, Iphigenia, that says, desire and beauty are the wings of great deeds. And then Hegel, in his own handwriting, has written en kai pan underneath there. And that one and everything, one and all, one with everything is the theme here. That was the motto of their little club, if you will. Well, there's Schelling again. Here's just some passages we'll be looking at. So we're talking about, just for a few seconds here, this idea, intellectual intuition. And what they suggest, Hölderlin writes about it, Schelling writes about it this time, is, okay, look, the human mind, you gain self-awareness by being divided from yourself. So the ability to be self-conscious means you see I'm here and other things are over there. That allows you to think at all, to be a person. And so there's an original division, and Hölderlin puns with the German word Urteil for this. Urteil, which means judgment, is original peace, original division. Teilen is to divide in German. So the word for judgment in German also implies an original division, he suggests. Okay, we've got the division, but how do we get things back together again? Well, it's this intellectual division, the ability to perceive things outside of our senses that makes this possible. Now, this only works when it's connected with what we might call a dynamic view of nature. And so if you look at a couple of passages we have up there, first of all, this is Schelling writing about this intellectual intuition, and he claims we have a secret and remarkable capacity to remove ourselves from the flux of time and withdraw into our own interior self, now stripped of all that is extraneous to it, and there, under the form of immutability, to observe eternity within ourselves. It's sort of a momentary eternity, if you will. We cease to be objects for ourselves. We become one with things that are outside of ourselves, in other words. But we awaken from intellectual intuition as from a state of death. We awaken through reflection, that is, through a forced return to ourselves. But no return is thinkable without resistance, no reflection without an object. We designate as alive an activity intent upon objects, and as dead an activity losing itself in itself. The I, on finding resistance, is obliged to take a stand against it, that is, to return to self. However, where sensuous intuition ceases, where everything objective vanishes, there is nothing but infinite expansion without a return into self. Should I maintain intellectual intuition, I would cease to live, I would go from time into eternity. Well, okay. And we can see maybe already where I'm going with that at the beginning of Hyperion. He has these fantasies of melding, blending into the ether, becoming one with the universe, which at the same time be a loss of individual self or ego. So Hölderlin then had hoped that he had this plan to write this series of philosophical letters that would explain this idea of intellectual intuition. Like many romantic plans, it never came about. However, his novel, it's a series of letters, did come about, and I would suggest that ultimately it's the novel itself, in a literary work, that he works out these ideas, expresses them. And the other part of it then, the other part of nature to make sense of this, is the idea of what we see here Schelling calls the world soul. He suggests, okay, look, rather than seeing nature as a bunch of discrete objects, how about if we imagine nature as one vast organism that's sort of shot through with a single force of energy that animates everything. Therefore, I'm not cut off from other people or other objects around me, isolated from them, but actually the same energy that animates me animates everything, even from moss and stones. The whole universe is in constant motion, striving towards self-articulation. So Schelling, famously says things like, eternal love has forever written the world as a poem, or the objective world is nothing but original, still unconscious poetry of spirit, or the imprint of this boundless and eternal desire for self is the world. So the desire of this world spirit, this eternal energy to express itself, creates material objects. That's what materiality is, and therefore, in this view, this dynamic view of nature that was so influential at the time, we overcome the gap between self and other because we're both part of the same dynamic force. That makes a little bit of sense. That's sort of the philosophical background, but I hesitate to use the word background exactly because ultimately, I'm not suggesting here that Hölderlin is taking abstract philosophical ideas and writing them into poetry, writing them into this novel, but rather that the novel itself is creating this philosophy simultaneously. That the images, the metaphors that he uses are bringing the philosophy to life. It's not just philosophy turned into literature, but the philosophy of the time is as much influenced by poetry as the other way around. So if we go back for a few minutes to the top of Acrocorinth. Let's see here. Those are some other passages from the novel. We won't get into right now. We'll go back to the top of Acrocorinth for a moment. Whoops. Those are American undergraduates at the top of Acrocorinth. No one wants to see that. I don't know how that got in there. That's scary. Okay. Never mind. Especially in the summer when I'm off work and off duty with them. But, you know, here we are back to the top of Acrocorinth. And I think it's not hard to see, just from the few passages we looked at from Hölderlin's novel, how these ideas of a dynamic, vibrant nature animate the novel and make it make sense in some way. I mean, a passage like, often lost in the wide blue, I look up at the ether and into the holy sea, and I feel as if a kindred spirit opened its arms to me, as if the pain of solitude dissolved into the life of the divinity. To be one with all, that is the life of the divinity, that is the heaven of man. That oneness is only possible because of this dynamic view of nature that sees all objects, even inanimate objects, shot through with this one living force, vitalizing force running through them. Now, the other side of that is both aesthetic and erotic. And if we had more time, we could look at some of the erotic passages of the novel as well and see that his connection with the love of his life, Diotima, also is implicated in this extra-sensual, if you will, intellectual, meaning non-material, view of nature, possibility of connecting with someone outside of yourself. But in the interest of time, we'll leave that for the time being. And take a turn now to Byron. So, well, there's an anonymous engraving from the 19th century from the top of Acrocorinth. Maybe a little bit more what it looks like when Byron was up there in 1810. So Byron has been called the anti-romantic romantic sometimes, because although himself a central figure in what is generally known as European Romanticism, his relationship to other British Romantics, particularly those of the older generation, such as Wordsworth, Coleridge, Robert Southey, is filled with parody, and he largely makes fun of them for various reasons. He's more a poet of the body than of the soul, you might say. And I think this insistence on materiality is something you see in his Acrocorinth poem, The Siege of Corinth, published in 1816 now. Of course, unlike Hölderlin, Byron had actually been to Corinth before writing his poem. So his first trip, 1809 to 1811, part of his grand tour that, of course, because of the Napoleonic Wars, he couldn't travel around much of Central Europe, ended up coming to Greece, Albania. In the summer and fall of 1810, when he was living in Athens, Byron took a number of field trips, if you will, around to various regions, including a couple of times to Corinth and Acrocorinth. Not unlike students today, living, of course, his accommodations weren't nearly as comfortable as the Athens Centre, taking field trips out to different areas, but nevertheless, that's what he did. It's a familiar model. This goes back to the time of Byron and earlier for visitors to Greece. The poem itself now, The Siege of Corinth, set during this Venetian-Ottoman War, one of them, the one in the early 18th century. It's a narrative poem of 1,170 lines, rhymed couplets for the most part, iambic tetrameter, short little rhyming lines. And although it tells a tragic tale, the tone is often irreverently ironic. Well, there's Byron. There he is. There he carved his name with Sunio, something you've probably seen. Also in 1810, he was there.